Okay, so UnionMax. Let's talk about it in a bit of a faster format compared to my usual content, since I think it'd be only appropriate to do so, not only for the sake of time, but also for the considerably smaller nature of this game as a whole. In fact, since this game does indeed have a reduced scope, one of the main differences from other Blitz games is that, in our likeness, the main cast of characters won't be interacting with each other as a group, like we see the jocks and campers do in their respective games. I think this can be deduced just by looking at some of the most prominent images we can find on the website, from which we can seemingly understand that the first thing we'll see upon starting a game is gonna be Max falling asleep on his bed, unsatisfied with his empty life, only to be transported into the mystical Cosmos dimension, where he meets the Voice, this glowing orb thing that asks him to collect pieces of a spark for a some yet unspecified reason. And to do so, Max is offered the possibility to go into one of 4 separate worlds where the love interests reside in. As such, if they live into totally different dimensions, it's unlikely they'll be able to interact with each other at all, and thus they'll basically only interact with Max. On top of that, the interface the player is given to make the choice of which world they want to go to also supports this scenario, since we can deduce how this Cosmos place where we find the Voice seems to be a sort of hub world for the game, to which we'll be able to go back to every time we finish a route. It is made pretty clear in the website, in fact, that the game will basically allow you to play, or not play, as many routes as you like during a single playthrough. So instead of thinking it like having to pick one route for one playthrough, and then to pick a different route you'll need to start a new game, think of UnionMax routes as watertight compartments that exist within the same save file as each other, but they won't be bleeding through among one another, or at least, not immediately. I'll explain in a little bit. This watertight route structure makes sense, because eliminating the group dynamic, at least in the beginning, allows for the writing portion of the game to go by much more quickly in development. If you only need to write 4 smaller storylines with only 2 central characters, instead of one bigger story with a central cast of 5, it'd be a lot easier to do and a lot faster to complete. And since again this game is being produced and is coming out in a relatively short turnaround window, it only makes sense that the devs would make this choice. This peculiar structure, however, also composes a certain complexity in the way endings will be handled, since the website reports that you'll essentially be able to trigger the ending whenever you want, presumably by clicking on the white orb thing, as long as you'll have completed at least one storyline. Such notions offer some interesting possibilities when coupled with routes that work as watertight compartments and the need for Max to gather spark pieces. I can assume in fact that to obtain the pieces of that spark thing, Max will need to successfully resolve the problem of each of the love interest. Thus, the player needs to play their cards right to make sure this happens, and their success or failure in doing so, along with how many routes we'll have completed, will determine the kind of ending we'll get. So let's say I managed to not gather any pieces of the spark, by failing at every route I try, and not even playing through some of them. Then I assume we will get a form of a bad ending, in which Max will be sent back to Earth to his empty and useless life as an office worker. If we instead manage to play through at least one route successfully, but we don't succeed at all 4, and then decide to finish the game, I assume that we'll unlock a sort of neutral/good enough ending, where Max will be allowed to go and live in the world with the guy he developed the most affection with, but the romance between them would not be that strong or prevalent. That's because, even if we were to get the best possible ending in any given single route, I think the relationship that will have developed between Max and the love interest would be more of a friendship with benefits, but still a friendship rather than actual proper romance. That's because it would feel kinda awkward if Max were to declare how much he loves, let's say, Raffi, and state that he wants to be together with him forever, but then he jumps into the portal next door only to boink Makoa and tell the shark boy he also is the love of his life. Hence why the need for the relationship to remain, at least at first, more platonic than romantic, even if of course they will be boinking, because this is a Blitz game after all. As such, to actually get the proper romantic 100% love of my life confession, what you'll need to do is probably to successfully complete all 4 routes and gather all the sparks. Once you have done so, I assume that what might end up happening is that something between a 5th chapter and an extended epilogue might play out, where the characters need to find the 5th spark that is tied to Max. However, instead of Max having to help somebody else in their world, this time it would be the opposite, and all full of interest would instead go to Earth to help out Max. I think this might be probable, since, as we'll soon see, the main conflict of other love interests seems to be tied to the way they are seen by their respective societies, so presumably that could also be the case for Max, hence the need for the love interest to go to Earth and help him out. And on top of that, if you remember, in the reveal images we can see head sketches of all the love interests without their animal parts, which could be a result of them being sent to Earth by the voice, since you see how it gives Max a different outfit every time he goes to a different world so he can better fit in. I don't see why the voice wouldn't remove the love interest animal parts whenever they go to Earth, so they can walk around and not freak people out because a fucking 2-meter tall human-dragon hybrid is going around town. So in this epilogue that would take place on Earth, the player would essentially be allowed to make their final choice on who Max is actually in love with, and if everything goes according to plan, by the end, Max will have become the Light Guardian hero or whatever he needs to be, and so he will be allowed to go and live in the world of his now, very much undisputed, boyfriend, where they'll proceed to promptly fuck as per Bliss' perfect ending tradition. But, taking a step back, I think it's time to ask which will be the thing with which Max will be helping the love interest in the first place. A good starting point to answer this question is observing that despite the widely different looks of the urbanized areas and vastly different biomes they are located in, I think that as per the reduced scope of the game, these urban centers are probably not cities but villages, with a strong sense of culture that is reflected in every aspect of their inhabitants' lives. This sets up a pretty meaningful yet contained scope and amount of conflict each of the routes can offer, which would be perfectly in line with the small nature of the game. This supposition, however, is kinda more of a retroactive deduction that came to mind after I had thought of what the potential stories for all the love interests could look like, based on what we know about them, which for clarity, all the info on them comes either from their website description, from the poem, and from the hidden text on the reveal sketches in the form of bye-buying letters, which is an old, real-life writing system used in the Philippines that the game adopts as its fantasy script. So with that out of the way, let's analyze the love interests one by one and see what they bring to the table. Starting off with Ano, which is the one with a bit more lore around him, is clearly tied to the feeling of angst, as per the variations of his line in the poem, and the hidden bye-bye text, ever so graciously translated by this Reddit user, speaks of Sand carrying grief and cries of help being unheard. If we move over to his website description, we learn a few more crucial details, as it states: travel to the realm of angst and meet Anu, a man cursed to live a life of isolation due to a mysterious relic. Help him find a way to break the curse and restore hope in his life. From the way things are worded in this description, it seems to me that the cursed relic they speak of is not something that Anu owns necessarily. We see that on his sprite there is nothing that could end up being interpreted as a cursed relic, and since our objective is to break the curse, not his curse, referring to Anu, it might indicate that Anu himself is not the cursed one, but rather it's something else that is cursed and that was making him suffer, even if indirectly. Judging by the way Anu tells Max to stay away from him in this Steam screenshot, my assumption is that Anu might be some sort of guardian to this relic that causes misfortune, and that by proxy of his assigned role, the people of his village believe he needs to be isolated, because otherwise there is a risk that the misfortune could hit other people, something that cannot happen if Anu remains away from everyone else. If there is any validity to the isolation measures, or if it's just a superstition, I can't tell for now, but regardless, it's clear that Anu very much internalizes it, and thus, Max's role would be to convince Anu that he too is deserving of living a fulfilling life, instead of spending all of eternity doing his best impression of Sailor Pluto. So the two of them will need to find a way to break the curse, which would presumably also need to involve the help of the frightened villagers, who will need to find the courage to go against the scary relic and actually do something about it instead of forever living under its thumb, which would parallel Anu's own arc of having to find hope again to overcome a dire situation. Moving on to Makoa, he is in a similar boat as Anu, pun not intended, when it comes to deductible lore. His phrase in the poem and the hidden script talk about romance losing its warmth and his heart being closed, while the website says that he is from a tribe full of traditions, and the Steam screenshot shows us that apparently his village is preparing for a festival. However, you might notice that something is a bit off in the background, since now I'm no expert in the field, but something tells me that seeing snow in a Polynesian-inspired village with stilt houses isn't exactly the most meteorologically conforming phenomenon, let's just put it like that. Add to that, how Makoa's names come from the mako shark, which does not live in cold waters, and that the problem he seems to have is that his heart has grown cold. And I'd say we can deduce that this unusual meteorological phenomenon for the era might symbolize the imbalance that Max will need to fix. As for what exactly is the thing that needs fixing, my first assumption is that it will be a personal problem of Makoa's, which would probably be something along the lines of how his village is preparing for the traditional festival that would, presumably, center around romance, while Makoa, even if he does externally tries to stay warm and to fit the spirit of the festival, hasn't yet gotten over a bad romantic experience that left him jaded. But because of his village's heavy emphasis on romance, and how it's always a wonderful thing that could never make you suffer, Makoa is not able to process the negatives of his previous relationship. Thus, this would actually be what makes him suffer. Or, my second, and maybe slightly more likely assumption, is that it's actually the entire village that has lost the traditional spirit of romance for some reason. Thus, the snow symbolizes everyone's hearts, and not just Makoa's, who on his end, in this scenario, would be the one that tries his hardest to keep the spirit of romance alive, but he's actually so invested in doing it because he needs a way to not think about his own reasons to feel jaded regarding love. As for what could be Makoa's or the widest village bad experience with romance, I'm really not sure. It could be anything really, though I would perhaps kinda exclude grief or an actual death, since having Makoa elaborate all of that in a story with a limited scope such as UnionMax could come off as quite rushed. Similar to the way in Camp Buddy, Yoichi basically gets over Yuki's death with just some encouraging words and a trip to Pound Town. So, well, guess we'll have to wait and see to see what's the reason behind Makoa feeling jaded. As for Raffi, he's also in a similar situation as the former two, his key trait being happiness, while his description on the website talks about him having to go through a ceremony that will change his life. Considering all of that, and the fact that his village looks like it'd be the death for all diabetics, his story might be instead about having to refuse whatever life-changing ceremony might be bestowed upon him. Since, even if it would be something that in theory should make everyone happy, or at least the village think that going through the ceremony is something that makes everyone happy, it's not something that would make Raffi specifically happy. As such, I see a bit of a theme of being to reject toxic positivity in this route, while also at the same time making the bird people understand that perhaps there is somebody else that would be very happy to take Raffi's place in the ceremony, even if the village does initially think that's something this substitute has any right to do. This leaves us only with Cygnus, and I don't have that much to say about him, sorry. Like, his key trait is being horny, literally and figuratively. But to be honest, at least in his initial presentation, there isn't that much to go off to about him. All I can deduce about him specifically is that he is a sex performer working some sort of Las Vegas-y Aztec volcano red light district, where all is valued is one's body and he'll have to break away from that social expectation and find value in something else that is not carnal desire. Though of course most of his deductions come from the fact that he of course needs to parallel the rest of the guys, and as such it's quite the no-brainer to think he'll end up going through something similar. Lastly, okay, hold on a moment, hi, train drop from the future here. So while I was editing, new stuff came out, and although nothing is groundbreaking, I think it was briefly discussing the side characters that got revealed. Even if we have zero info about them beyond their appearances and names, I think there is still something we can get out of them. So in order from least to most interesting, Habagat is Makoa's side characters, and with a name that in Tagalog, the language spoken in the Philippines, translates to a kind of monsoon, it's clear that he is Makoa's ex, who left the destruction of a powerful storm in our shark's boy's heart. Next up is Garrett, who is clearly some kind of co-worker of Cygnus, who might also be a drug dealer judging from the fact that he smokes, and is forced to stuff large amounts of cash in improbable places on his person, since pockets are very clearly not a thing in the non-Earth realms. To me, Gareth just looks like the personification of the bad kind of desire that Cygnus needs to distance himself from if he wants to grow as a person. Also, if you put their names together, it comes out as cigarette spelled with the X, which I think is honestly quite funny. Then there is Seth, who is a more twinkish carbon copy of Anu, which make me think he could be his younger brother. The presence of ominous dark bandages on his limb and torso, along with the fact that he keeps one of his arms in a position that makes it seem as if it's injured, also makes me think that perhaps the reason of Seth's ill-being was an unfortunate encounter with the cursed relic we already discussed, thus strengthening Anu's resolve to protect the other people by being the only one exposed to it. Lastly, there is Lanciel, who very much looks like an older, bigger version of Raffi, though unlike with Seth and Anu, I wouldn't say for certain they are related, since Raffi has pink hair while Lancel is blonde. However, I do think there is quite a lot to speculate about him actually, but let me preface it by saying that basically, as soon as Raffi's website description got revealed, I always had a gut feeling on what exactly his ceremony would entail, and who the possible substitute for him would end up being. However, I didn't put this idea in the initial script for the theory video, since it would have largely been baseless speculation. With Lancel's reveal, however, I can say that my gut was right on what a possible Raffi substitute for the ceremony would look like, as I had indeed a feeling that one of his side characters would be somebody that could essentially be considered buff Raffi, which is exactly what Lancel is. On top of that, his name is the union of the word Lancelot, the legendary knight of King Arthur, and Ciel, French for sky, and since he's a bird knight, I'd say his name fits in perfectly. This goes on to create an interesting duality with Raffi, since on one end you have the dashing masculine knight, as suggested by his name, and on the other you have the little and cute, so more quote-unquote feminine, Raffi. This dichotomy becomes interesting when you consider that we are dealing with a fantasy race of people, hence they might have a different way in which they experience sex and gender. It could be possible that, to make an example, maybe the bird people naturally spawn from the eggs that spontaneously generate in the Rainbow Falls, but they are all born as guys, who are held up to the heroic ideal of masculine knights ever since childhood. However, it's only later on in their lives that some of them, perhaps the more quote-unquote feminine ones like Raffi, are instead expected to go through a ceremony which from then on will make them assume what, for Elf standards, would be a more traditionally quote-unquote womanly role in their societies. So the core of the conflict could be that Lancel, despite embodying the perfect masculine ideal, would actually really love to go through the ceremony and start to fill in that more quote-unquote womanly role, while Raffi instead feels himself more in line with the masculine role of a knight that saves people, since that's what Raffi is already doing as soon as we meet him, considering that his meeting CG features him saving Max as for Earthboy free falls in the sky. Hence, as I already said, the point would be that Raffi and Lancel would need to learn that they can go against their society's gender expectation by switching places at the ceremony to ensure that each of them can find their own kind of happiness, and thus not be forced into a role they wouldn't really like for the rest of their lives. And at the same time, it might also help villagers understand that gender is a much more fluid concept compared to what they initially might think it is. Lastly, circling back to my prediction about having a Max-centered epilogue happening on Earth, if this does ultimately end up being the case, since Max mentioned his employment being a dead-end job, it'd be an interesting conflict if at the start of said epilogue he is offered a surprise promotion to a higher paying, but a lot more soul-crushing position, and for some reason, he'll feel pressure to take the offer. Said reason could be perhaps because, unlike most isekai protagonists, he might have a family member or two that give a flying fuck about him, and thus would want him to be comfortable economically, but ultimately, Max's decision would be, just like the rest of the love interest, to go against the key pillar of his, well, our society, that being materialism, and choose a more free life in one of the fantasy worlds, either being honest with his family about the magic shenanigans, or passing it off as him moving to another country with his new BF. And since Max becomes the next light of the cosmos or something, I assume interdimensional traveling might become a part of his skill set, so he could occasionally go back to Earth for visits.